anti-American sentiment over a 6-year-old boy called Elian Gonzalez, who was rescued off the Florida coast after being shipwrecked during an illegal attempt to reach the U.S. His mother had drowned. Elian was taken to Florida, but the U.S. court ruled he should go back to his father in Cuba. It was for Cuba a huge victory. Former diplomat Carlos Alzugaray says De Laurentiis is well respected.
We see him as a friend. We see him as someone who hasn't come here to screw up the relations. I think Jeff is aware of what happened in Cuba. He's sensitive to what might make the Cubans mad about U.S. foreign policy. He really can understand that. And we see it. We get the impression that he's understanding what you are selling.
As much as Jeffrey De Laurentiis will be forging a new future, the brown 6-story embassy building is living history of the turbulent U.S.-Cuba relations. It sits on Havana's Malecon, or seafront promenade, and looks out onto the Florida Strait. Ties were cut in 1961, and several years later it became the U.S. interest section under the legal protection of the Swiss embassy. Just in front of the building is what's known as the anti-imperialist stand, a huge plaza built at the height of tensions over Elian Gonzalez, where the anti-American demonstrations took place. On one side are big letters that read "Fatherland or Death" and "Venceremos, we will triumph," in the words of the Cuban Revolution. Around 140 flagpoles obscure the view of the building. That's of course an exception. They were erected in reaction to U.S. Twitter that flashed human rights messages and criticism of the Cuban government during the Bush administration. This new direction for both countries, one that Raul Castro says will take determination. Here in Cuba, it seems that heat gets the shock. Katie Watson reporting from Cuba. Ending poverty, hunger, building resilient infrastructure and conserving the oceans are just a few of the new major development goals that the world will commit to trying to achieve by 2030. And they have a new name. The Sustainable Development Goals will replace the current Millennium Development Goals. Some critics argue we're taking on even more ambitious targets before we come close to achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Something I put to Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and for the last 6 years, the head of the United Nations Development Programme.
The Millennium Development Goals had a lifetime of 15 years, and that lifetime is up at the end of this year. So there was always going to be a discussion about what would replace them. A lot of the challenges that we face have worsened since the Millennium Development Goals were written. For example, the challenge of inequality. The UNDP estimates that 70% of people in developing countries live in societies which are more unequal today than they were in 1990, the baseline date for the MDGs. As well, these challenges of environmental degradation and how it's impacting on particularly the poorest and most vulnerable communities are much more pressing now.
When you say the challenges have worsened, isn't that just another way of an admission that the Millennium Development Goals, they've actually not succeeded?
Well, quite a lot have had quite a lot of success. There was a global burden of disease study which looked at trends on the health areas targeted in the MDGs before the MDGs were launched and after. And it seems indisputable that we've made much faster progress because of the goals and targets and the rallying of finance and action and initiatives around them.
The Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them with 169 targets. With the Millennium Development Goals, there were 8 goals and 21 targets, and you can count them slightly differently. It does suggest that this is more ambitious on the surface, but it could also suggest that it's too unfocused.
Well, it could suggest both those things, and it's also universal, so it applies to the United Kingdom as it applies to Burkina Faso. Even rich countries have poverty. So, yes, a much larger agenda, and without doubt if you can mainstream into the country's national development agenda these priorities and then get the countries developing their strategies, their policies, what has to happen to implement around that, you will get action.
What would you say then to this really quite serious bit of work that's been done by Bjorn Lomborg, the founder of the Copenhagen Consensus Centre? He argues that promising everything to everyone, which is what he is suggesting the Sustainable Development Goals are doing, gives no direction. Having 169 priorities is the equivalent of having none at all.
Well, I think the open working group of member states could be best, but when you open it up to a broad global consultation in every country's view, you end up with an agenda which is much wider than the MDG agenda was. That's why I think the work within countries to look at what really needs to be accelerated to make a difference is very, very important. And for the poorest countries, we would certainly want to keep that focus on the children in school, the basic livelihoods, the movement of property, the essential health services, the water supply, the things that make a huge difference.
And what about the issue of climate change? Because if you ended fossil fuel subsidies, that would cost $37 billion a year, but it would help to cut CO2 emissions. It would also free up close to $600 billion of public money across the world.
Definitely, and I'm certainly an advocate for getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. It has to be done in a way which minimises the impact on the poorest people. But for sure, most of the benefit of fossil fuel subsidies is not going to the poorest people now, it's going to others. They should go, and that also incentivises a move towards cleaner energy production.
That was Helen Clark, head of the United Nations Development Programme. Don't forget you can tell us what you think about what you hear on our programme. At BBC NewsHour is our Twitter handle. You can put something up on Facebook, BBC World Service on Facebook, or you can tweet me directly at Razia Iqbal. Whatever you do, don't go away. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Razia Iqbal. This is NewsHour. And in half an hour here on the BBC World Service, it's time for World Have Your Say, and Chloe Tilly is joining in the studio. What's coming up, Chloe?
We're going to be talking about the Russian billionaire Yuri Milner. Of course, he's donated $100 million of his own money over the next 10 years to see if there's life in space, from aliens to plants and anything in between. He's got the backing of Stephen Hawking, he's got a team of crack scientists behind him, and he's renting 3 of the best telescopes the planet can find. They're going to point them where he thinks there could be hope for life all around the cosmos. Teams of researchers will process the results, but there'll be crowdsourcing as well, so it'll be put out there to amateurs to try and process the results and all work together. But there's a huge question about, is it worth it? And a big, heated discussion on our Facebook page about whether this is the best way money should be spent. Should we be trying to look for life on other planets? There are plenty of problems here on Earth. But of course, this is a private individual. It's his money. We'll be talking to lots of people with lots of opinions on this in half an hour.
I'm sure you will. Chloe Tilly, World Have Your Say in half an hour. Coming up here on NewsHour in the next 30 minutes, long queues outside banks in Greece as they open for the first time in 3 weeks. We'll hear from our reporter in Athens. We'll also get a response here in Britain to Prime Minister David Cameron's latest speech on tackling radicalisation among young British Muslims, and a rare interview with a senior Burmese general talking about landmark elections due to take place later this year in Myanmar. Before all that, let's have a summary of the latest world news.
BBC News with Jonathan Izard. An explosion has killed at the
Il faudrait me descendre devant les gardes là. Vous voyez?
The Turkish Interior Ministry said about 100 others have been injured.
C'est là. Attendez, j'éteins. Voilà, c'était...
Confronting the intolerant ideas that caused the planet's worth of